Hi everyone, and this week our topic is human rights and seeking asylum in our course Human Rights Theory and Philosophy. So we're going to be speaking today about the rights of people who are refugees, who are displaced from their homes. As I'm sure many of you would know, and some of you personally would know very well, that we are now in the midst of the largest forced movement of people around the world since World War II. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees considers that there are currently some 65 million people in the world who have been forced to leave their homes. More than 21 million of these have been recognised as refugees, which means they've been forced to leave their countries. Millions of others wait for their refugee claims to be recognised. I think it's worth commenting here at the outset too, is to remind ourselves of where the biggest proportion of people who are refugees are currently residing. So the top hosting countries, again, this is drawing on the UN High Commissioner for Refugees figures. You can find this at their website, Figures at a Glance. The top hosting countries are Turkey, Pakistan, Lebanon, Iran, Ethiopia and Jordan, and combined they host more than 7.5 million people who are refugees. So, and they're not the only countries who are neighbouring countries, countries in the global south. They're the countries who are having to bear, the greatest responsibility for hosting people who are refugees, despite what we see with the media reports of people going to Western Europe, for example, last year. Still the vast majority of people reside in countries close to their own, where they try to find some sort of safety. Now, in this lecture, we will explore some of the ways in which we can understand the situations that people who do flee persecution endure. So we'll be talking first of all about some definitions, some terminology. Then we'll talk about refugees, state sovereignty and borders to see how we might better understand the situation that it is that people have to flee their own state. We'll talk about the impacts of political rhetoric in the sense of how people who are refugees are received in other countries. And then we'll talk about the lived experiences of people needing to find a life of safety. People's own experiences often ignored in many, at least political debates about this topic. So let's start with some definitions. Well, according to the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, this is the definition. People who are, this is the gist of the definition. People who are refugees are those who are outside their country of nationality and unable or unwilling to return to it due to a well-founded fear of persecution by their state because of their political beliefs, race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group. So what is obvious, first of all, from this definition, as I said, which draws on the convention, this definition makes it clear that people who are refugees are forced to move. So this is different from someone that we would call a migrant. A migrant is someone that we usually consider has a choice about moving, whereas refugees don't. And to be recognised as a refugee means being able to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution if they return to their state. In other words, a well-founded fear of facing serious human rights abuses. The convention only relates to those who are outside their country. And so a refugee is someone who's considered to have has had to flee their country due to the grounds above there. So it doesn't relate to internally displaced people who nevertheless obviously need great assistance and in terms of finding safety as well. And the definition only applies to persecution by the person's state, not other actors. So there are limits to this definition. There's also only a limited range of reasons for which a person may be persecuted under the convention. As you'll see, the list there, which says, the last bit saying, because of their political beliefs, race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group. So, for example, this doesn't include women fleeing violence by non-state actors because of their gender or fleeing domestic violence. It doesn't include people fleeing natural disasters or outbreaks of disease, or people fleeing more generalised violence that may threaten anyone, not just particular groups of people. So there are limits to who is considered to be a refugee under this UN Convention definition. Now, there are other definitions. Some states go beyond or widen their definition. Many states stick to this one or even restrict it further. But there are other definitions that do expand on this. And the African Union is an example of this when it adopted created its article on the definition of a refugee. It expanded it. It starts as a base, the definition by the UN Convention, but then it expands on it, and it expands on it in this way. So, for example, here, Article 1, subsection 2 says the term refugee shall also apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination or events seriously disturbing public order in either part or the whole of his country of origin or nationality, is compelled to leave his place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside his country of origin or nationality. So it expands on this definition, on the definition of the UN Convention, to include people who would be fleeing famine, natural disasters or ongoing war. You'll notice the gendered language, his there. It is assumed there to also, to include all people. but when it was drafted, that was the kind of gendered language that was used. So that's some thoughts about how commonly people who are refugees, how that term refugee is defined. So what about an asylum seeker? Let's look at some other definitions. An asylum seeker is someone who seeks asylum at or inside a state's borders that is not their own country. So someone who has gone to another country claiming to be a refugee, but at that point in time, they have not yet had their refugee claim considered. So until the time that their claim is considered and finalised, that person usually is called, labelled an asylum seeker. Another definition it's important to be aware of is non-refoulement. This principle of non-refoulement under the UN Convention is important here. Under the Convention, this means that states cannot refuse entry to someone who is an asylum seeker if this would mean the person has to go back to the state where they are likely to face persecution. So it's an attempt to try to protect people who arrive at other countries seeking asylum, to protect them from being returned if they are likely to face persecution. But we have to know that under the Convention, states don't have a duty to admit refugees. And so this can force people who are refugees into very temporary arrangements. More about this later. Another term often heard in discussions about people who are refugees or asylum seekers is an economic migrant. Now, this term refers to people arriving at other states who are seeking a better standard of living. So it suggests there is a choice being made here. Now, what we need to be aware of, though, is that there is often a range of reasons why people will arrive at another country, and they may try to seek asylum when they're there. So people often express that they have fled persecution and also conditions of poverty. That's not unusual. It can be multiple reasons. So we need to be wary of the term economic migrant when it's used to describe the arrival of people who are claiming asylum. But we also need to ask if we should deny refuge, if we should deny asylum to someone who is seeking to escape a life of poverty. We could think about and consider that poverty is a form of violence, just as persecution is. So if we think of it in that way, it becomes much more complex than that simple term economic migrant suggests. Now, another point I'd like to make at the outset here is also how we use language to describe others. Using terms such as refugee and asylum seeker can reduce someone to being defined only by their experience of needing to find somewhere safe to live. Now, these terms at least are generally understood as denoting people who have the right to flee persecution and try to find safety somewhere, as opposed to terms such as illegal immigrant, queue jumper, or economic migrant even. And being defined as a refugee can sometimes mean a measure of protection is provided to you, such as access to services and resources, if not citizenship. And for a small minority of people recognised as refugees in the world, there may also be the opportunity to be resettled in another country and recognised as a citizen. However, even using terms such as refugees and asylum seekers can effectively reduce a person to being defined as someone who is simply needing to flee, to define someone as just being a person that needs to flee persecution. So being labelled as a refugee or asylum seeker can carry with it connotations of powerlessness, not belonging, and exclusion. And people who are refugees are often the subject of others' politics and actions, presented as victims of threats and rarely allowed any agency themselves. In an attempt to minimise this, I'll try to use the phrases people who are refugees, people seeking asylum, to at least suggest there is much more to someone than just their experience of fleeing persecution. It's also, I think, a good reminder that we are talking about people. We're not talking about so-called hordes of people. We're not talking about flows of refugees or any other way of describing people seeking asylum that can diminish their humanity. Okay, let's move on there to think about people who are refugees and the relationship here between being a refugee and state sovereignty and borders. Now, to understand the situations that people fleeing persecution often face requires us to have a look at the relationship between people who are refugees and state sovereignty, and a range of writers examine the relationship between the state system and refugees, for example, including Emma Haddad. Now, since the Treaty of Westphalia, which this painting represents, in 1648, the international system has developed into a collection of sovereign states. The Treaty of Westphalia established legal relations between states for the first time, and belonging to a community became dependent, as Haddad puts it, on the secular concept of nationality rather than religious affairs. Sovereignty was constructed to mean that all states are considered legally equal by international law, and this means that no state should interfere in the domestic concerns of another state. So within a territory, the state is considered to be the supreme governing body for its citizens. And so a sovereign state is considered to be autonomous in the international system and can control what happens in its domestic affairs, that is, within its borders. And the nation state is a term used to suggest that states represent some homogenous group of people, which suggests that the state, in Haddad's words, is a means of organising people. And the development of the international state system and the rise of the concept of nationality, again in Haddad's words, led to very clear definitions of who belonged to a community and who did not. Now, the UN Charter, which was the treaty that established the United Nations after the Second World War, the UN Charter prioritises state sovereignty. So after World War II, it was considered that threats to individual and state security were more likely to come from other states rather than from your own state. As we talked about earlier in the course, in the UN Charter, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Human Rights Treaties, an individual's rights are considered claims against the state. The state is considered to be an important actor in promoting and protecting the human rights of its citizens and those elsewhere. But while international human rights law seeks to elevate individual rights over state sovereignty, international law has itself very weak enforcement mechanisms. So, knowing all of this, what are the implications then for people facing persecution by their own state? Well, Alenikoff argues that refugees represent a failure of the state system. The state system means that individuals need to belong to a state to ensure their protection. And this is reinforced by the human rights concept portrayed in international law. But we know the state system is not providing that protection in many circumstances. Some states persecute or threaten to persecute their citizens, forcing them to flee. And other states are not obliged to guarantee the rights of people to seek asylum, and often seek to prevent or deter their arrival. Not all states, but seemingly an increasing amount of states are seeking to do that. And so from the perspective of people who are fleeing persecution, the state system often fails to provide them with protection. Now, Emma Haddad goes further, and she argues that refugees are not the consequence of a breakdown in the system of separate nation states. Rather, they are an integral part of the system. She argues that you cannot have the modern state system without also having refugees. Again, this is another quote from her. She says, "It's a characteristic of sovereignty that the attempt to place all individuals within homogeneous territorial spaces will inevitably force some between borders into the gaps and spaces between states, and thus outside the normal citizen-state territory hierarchy. As such," she argues, refugees are victims of an international system that brings them into being, then fails to take responsibility for them. It's up to states, by and large, to provide protection to refugees. However, it's also states that have their sovereignty protected under international law and are able to decide who can enter and stay in their territory. Now, Haddad also argues that the state system is predicated on categorising people as insiders and outsiders. So as a political entity, a nation-state presupposes the existence of an enemy and seeks to preserve its identity in the face of threats from those who may want to destroy it. So she's arguing here, or suggesting here, that a nation-state needs an enemy in order to give meaning to its existence. She suggests that defining someone or some group as the enemy is necessary to consolidate identities within the state. We could reflect on this in relation to some of the decisions and language used by President Trump in the US, who earlier this year, and continues also, to try to ban people from particular countries, including refugees. Earlier he did try to ban from 7 Muslim majority countries on the grounds, in his words, that the security of our nation is at stake. Now let's have a closer look at identity then, because this touches on this important area, I guess, of identity and attempts to forge an identity, as well as belonging. So let's do this by looking at the concept of borders. Now, borders define who can and cannot live within a state. They define belonging. This is drawing on the work of Sonia Tascon. Borders are about distinguishing ourselves from others. They represent and perpetuate group identity. They also provide an illusion of unity and safety for those within them. They are physical and metaphysical constructs that, in Tascon's words, justify the exclusion of those outside the line. So people who are refugees, particularly those who are already within another state's borders, challenge these notion of borders. Crossing the border comes to represent a challenge to our ability to exclude the other, and a challenge to our perceived safety and security. And yet, goods and services, capital, information, and the wealthy are able to cross borders without challenging notions of safety and security by and large. State borders have become much more porous for the transfer of goods and services, capital and information, and the wealthy in most of the developed world, but not for people who are refugees. So we are experiencing increasing challenges to sovereignty and control of borders in relation to the globalization of capital and goods and services and the wealthy, but not in relation to people fleeing persecution. We could also ask, though, how strong is this notion of borders in enabling us to distinguish ourselves from others? You might like to think about, is our sense of identity really bound up with the state that we are within? Is this always the case? Are there other forms of identity that compete with a national identity or are stronger? Within many states, there are a range of different ethnic groups, for example, that may have shared identity. If our sense of identity is bound up with our belonging to a state, how much of this identity is bound up, though, with who we are not? Do we need an enemy to be unified, to have a unified identity? And how much of this is constructed and facilitated by powerful leaders within a state? Now, that's a question we're going to further explore in part B, in the second part of this lecture on human rights and people seeking asylum.